Welcome to our online audience and to week 3 of the Energy Justice Seminar. Our guest this week is Zaid Ashai, the chair and CEO of Nexamp. I want to let everybody know we had not listed the speaker for next week, but next week we have the Chief of Staff of the Office of State and Community Energy Programs at the Department of Energy, who will be giving us an amazing overview of the IRA. What we've been doing this semester so far, we started with Denise Abdul-Rahman talking to us about the roles of communities in energy justice. We have a great leader in renewable energy today in Zaid Ashai to ground us a little bit in new forms of energy and their relationship to energy justice. And then next week, talking about the big enchilada where all the big money is, the Inflation Reduction Act and the hundreds of billions of dollars that our economy is dealing with and will hopefully drive some energy justice if we're lucky or do our jobs. So with that, welcome to our online audience and welcome to everybody in the classroom. I just told everybody in the classroom that a lot of the questions will be coming from the classroom, so be patient with us as we pass the mic around. Online audiences, please send in your Q&A, and Julia will pull up questions from there in about 20 or 30 minutes to try to pull some of the questions from the online audience in as well. Zaid Ashai joining us today is chair and CEO of Nexamp. I think I'm going to ask him about this stuff, but started his career really in finance. And has been a leader in innovative finance and clean energy ever since. And we welcome him. His company is an incredible leader and innovator in the space, and we'll find out some about how and why through this interview today. So welcome, Zaid.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit first about just your own personal life and path to this work before we talk about Nexamp. Tell me a bit about how you came to the energy field, and then I'll ask you a little bit about energy justice after that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for giving me the opportunity here. My background into energy was a little bit circuitous and was followed a little bit of a non-traditional path. It's not something I knew when I was 6 or 7 years old that I wanted to do. But a few things about me which I think impacted sort of why I decided to pursue a career in clean energy. Both my parents were immigrants from Kashmir between India and Pakistan. So whether I'm Indian or Pakistani is a cause for political debate. But there was a few things that I learned spending a lot of time back there. I grew up in DC, was about the nature of environment, the importance of the environment to sort of the economy. So if you think about Kashmir, it's a mountainous area, glacial snow caps, very critical for water resources, both in India and Pakistan. It happened also that my grandfather was a hydro engineer in Pakistan. Our family was split with partition between India and Pakistan. And I spent a lot of sort of formative years when I was 8 or 9 looking at one of the largest hydroelectric power facilities built in Pakistan called Turbela. And my grandfather was the chief engineer there, so really saw it. It imprinted in me sort of in the power of sort of large scale development for electricity. It was out of this world. It was like something for me out like Star Wars because it changed the landscape of that region for good and bad. I mean, at that time, I didn't understand what hydro could also do to indigenous communities in those area. And sort of that influenced me quite a bit. I went to a liberal arts college at Brown. I thought at the time I was going to do international development with a focus on sustainability. I thought I was going to do actually pursue a path in the foreign service. For a number of reasons, it didn't work out. I looked at government. I realized with my personality profile, it just was too slow, too bureaucratic, and the pace of change wasn't great. Another influencer while I was also in college was Al Gore, was the vice president at that time while I was finishing up my undergraduate studies at Brown. And there was a lot of discussions about the environment, et cetera. So it was in my mind. But unfortunately, like many sort of liberal arts, candidates, when you graduate, when you don't know what you want to do, you go into finance. And I joke, my mom was super disappointed. I was the first one in finance in my family. Everyone had gone to like law or medicine or academia. And it was a little bit of a sort of like crisis moment. It was a kick save. But it actually really helped me on my career journey in finance. I learned and I fell in love with the idea of sort of how to build businesses, how to challenge status quos, how to take ideas that are nascent and actually get them to a point that they can be deployed. So I did that for a few years in New York. And then, as you alluded to, I spent most of my career in private equity and did a business school degree in between. And within private equity, that's when I really started leaning into sustainability and clean energy. That was like a passion for mine. I didn't want to do finance for finance sake. I wanted to do something where I felt that I could have an impact on the environment, and somewhat in a way that was also with a justice lens, which we can talk about through this discussion. So spent time, and one of the actually faculty members or leaders here in Yale in the environment school was one of the first people to hire me in this endeavor doing clean energy private equity. His name's Richard Kaufman. And there I really sort of got my chops working on wind, solar, hydro, but like really small catchment river hydro, so like 3-hour storage. And I fell in love with it. I was like, this is kind of what I want to do, build businesses that are decarbonizing global economies, but also build businesses that are doing well by the communities. And did that for 4 years. And then at that point, I also was getting this itch to be in an operating company. The one thing you see with even clean energy finance or any traditional finance, you're several steps away from being really involved in the nitty-gritty of implementation. And at that point, an opportunity arose at Nexamp. Nexamp was actually one of the companies we invested in. It was one of the many clean energy companies that in the second term of the Obama presidency was really struggling because of the Great Recession, because there wasn't enough federal and state support. So I joke the reason I got that role, I was actually probably the least qualified. No one wanted that role. No one in their right mind would take a job with a clean energy company that had 2 months of cash left. And I'm a risk taker, and I was like, oh, this is my best shot because I don't have any usable skill sets from liberal arts or finance to run a company. And was really fortunate to be in this journey. I've been at Nexamp 10 years. When I joined the company, we were primarily a commercial industrial focused solar company, focused solely in Massachusetts and a little bit in Rhode Island. And we eventually pivoted this business model to look at generation and the consumer side of the business. So majority of our business is in community solar now, focused in 19 states from Hawaii all the way out to Maine, and focused in sort of how do you attribute a lot of these benefits when you're building solar power plants to customers in an equitable fashion. So maybe later in the course, you'll see some of the challenges with solar, especially residential solar, typically favor wealthier customers. Because if you think about it, you need a credit score, you need to own your home. There's already some structural barriers. And the really cool thing we have been able to do with Nexamp is scale it, but in a way that we are serving folks that typically get overlooked in the clean energy economy.
Very cool. Well, thank you. Tell us a little bit about your path to energy justice then. I mean, you've alluded to a little bit, but what are the things that sort of drew you in that direction or called out to you to move in that way?
Yeah, I think honestly it goes back to my childhood. I've had my great-grandfather was incarcerated for fighting for civil rights in Kashmir. My mom's brother, my uncle was, my granduncle was. So it was in my DNA. Fighting for those whose voices aren't heard, fighting for indigenous rights, fighting for the right to sort of have a political voice at the table. And unfortunately, the region I'm from has had legacies of colonialism from the British to before the British, Russians, Chinese in our history. So there's a little bit, it's like in the DNA when you grow up in a conflict-torn region, it's there. So for example, my sister, I look at her, she pursued a different path. She's in law and she's in Texas fighting south of the border for legal rights for a number of immigrants coming across Texas. So I think it was imprinted on us that justice mattered in whatever we do, whether it be medicine, whether it be finance, which is a lot harder, unfortunately, or law. And that lens kind of was seared in my mind from an early age. And that candidly also, I was probably more politically aware than the standard kid. My mom did some interesting things. She like made me read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was in 4th grade. Not sure if it's like super age appropriate, but those would be the kind of things she did and challenged me. And same thing with my father as well. Even though we're immigrants, she really seared into my sort of collective memory about sort of the history of this country, the challenges, right, of how we took indigenous rights away. And the question she'd always ask me in middle school, she's like, "What are you going to do about Native rights and First Nation rights?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I'm in sixth grade." It's at that point, but those kind of nudges were really important for me, and it influenced a lot of stuff I did in Brown outside of energy. And then when I got into energy, uh, it was something like I always asked our team at Nexamp, like, how are we doing this? What's the impact? So for example, when I started, the second year I started at Nexamp, we thought about community solar, so which you'll hopefully send some readings if you're curious about it. But the idea is community solar is you're building big power plants and attributing credits to customers. So when we started looking at it, most companies were picking the wealthiest customers, high credit scores. And I was like, it's basically redlining. If folks have studied real estate or the mortgage industry, banks used to put red lines around Black and Brown or LMI communities. And it was like inadvertently solar is doing the same thing. So the idea then we were like, okay, we'll sell credits to anyone, no credit scores, focus on LMI neighborhoods. And then we went to the banks, for example. And they laughed us out of the room. They're like, there is no way that we're ever going to finance it. And instead of being,
Let me just ask you, because they thought that default rates would be high.
Default rates are too high, and they're like, well, why are you? And it was also a question like, why are you doing that? Like, hey, just go through the credit scores, get FICO scores for everyone.
Right.
And I was like, well, that's going to be an issue if they see FICO scores for the customers we're trying to address.
Yeah.
So I think the assumption is default rates are going to be high. People who are in LMI communities aren't going to care about saving money and clean energy. That's a supposition they had, which is pretty wild how problematic it is. But then I'd ask them, it's like, so when you finance a fast food chain in a LMI community, why are you doing that? They're like, well, we know there's going to be demand. I'm like, well, so why do you think there's going to be no demand there? So anyway, so I had the doors slammed like 6 or 7 times. And what we did, instead of sort of losing our drive to do it, we then started approaching credit unions and regional banks that actually in their charter cared about the communities they're in. And we just said, hey, give us a shot. Like if it fails, it's on us. We'll figure out how to rectify it, but give us a shot. Let's build this data set. And it took a few years of that. And we showed 4 customers had no higher default rates. They cared as much about clean energy. And it was just a matter of engaging them where they were. And then you imagine then 5, 6 years later, now where we are is we're doing the largest solar financings in distributed generation and community solar with the state banks, the large multinationals who have accepted it because now they have data. So it was a good lesson of like, you try to argue with the big banks, you're not going to get there. Instead of giving up, it's like, how do you adjust your business model with different members of the banking community, and then come back and challenge those that shut the door on you in the first place.
Yeah. No, it's an amazing lesson in just how the biases of the broader biases in the society, and you're going to run into them in this work and you can't turn away, right? It's like the communities live those biases. If we're trying to help them or serve them, right, we can't just be like, oh, those biases exist, darn, it's a wall. Like we have to, just like the communities who face them, figure out ways around them, figure out ways over them. It's a great story. I want to dive a little bit more into the nature of the business before, and I'm going to come back to the broader question of, I'll give you a little heads up on this, why renewable energy is critical to energy justice and vice versa, maybe, which I think is a big question, why I sort of wanted this to be the third week of the seminar before we even got into the details of what's happening policy-wise and everything else. But talk a little bit about the split in your business between facilities, hardware, siting, and finance, and what are the relative importance of those things. I was just talking to Zaid about an analogy I often use, which is that the clean tech industry is a little bit like Detroit in 1910. There were 210 car companies in Detroit in 1910, right? And so what you're seeing like in solar, I think it's a little further than 1910 for clean energy, but not much further. So in 1910, there probably weren't specialized carburetor companies, right? But there are starting to be, for example, inverter companies or pieces of equipment related to solar. There are sales forces that go across different companies and sell multiple vendors to customers. But at the same time, by 1950, the General Motors GMAC, whatever the AC stood for, credit company basically, was larger than General Motors itself. So the financing of cars by 1950 was a bigger business than car making. What you're seeing in solar is some really interesting hybrids and innovation between finance and installation and building. So I'm just interested in the model and where you all see that at Nexamp.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the way we've approached distributed generation is we look at it from a customer first angle. We want to make sure that whatever we do, the customer has a seamless experience. They have access to green energy from wherever they may come from as a household or a corporation, that it's a really clean, elegant experience, that they're going to want to repeat and continue to do that. And they're also going to be promoters. So obviously, selfishly, from a business standpoint, that's a better way to run a business. But from an environmental movement standpoint, if you have users that have bad experience with clean energy, they're going to be detractors. And it hurts not only your company, but the rest of the industry. So, when we built a business model, we started with the consumer. And we decided, unlike most companies in this industry, that we'd be vertically integrated. So to the points that you raised, we do development, we build the facilities, we own them, and we manage them, and then we sell the energy from the facilities. So we develop, deploy, finance all in under one roof. And the reason that that's important is a lot of the industry, kind of to your analogy, there's way too many players. Unfortunately, becomes a disjointed experience. So an example is a lot of the work we do on the facility side is farmers. So if you can imagine farmers in the Northeast, a lot of small farmers getting decimated by industrialization of farming, which really stinks. Problem from a climate perspective, problem from a food security standpoint, problem from sort of these communities. That is the best economic driver. And this large-scale manufacturing of food has destroyed economics. So if you think about it, when we go to farmers, they view solar as a crop. And I'll send you sort of video on that, which you can share with the class. Again, these aren't hippies by any means. They're not like, oh, planet's burning, but they do see it. They do see it in crop yields, et cetera. So again, it's meeting people where they are, and messaging is really important. But if you think about it, typically in the industry with these 209 companies analogy would go, okay, I'm going to go to the farmer, and then I'm going to try to find a financing company that's going to do this. Then I'm going to try to build it. Typically, that farmer, landowner, would talk to 7 people. No one wants to do that. Energy is not the top focus for some of these customers. It's important to them, but if it's that disjointed, it's going to be a problem. Whereas for us, when we do this development with a landowner, or a rooftop owner, or a customer, they know it's going to be delivered. They know financing is not an issue. They know building's not an issue or not. So that's the way we've approached it. We're not in the manufacturing business. We have a team that assesses the best technologies. We have a lot of knowledge and IP on how to integrate them. We actually just did a recent thing with Secretary Granholm, where we invested our balance sheet into a domestic manufacturer for the Inflation Reduction Act up in Minnesota.
A domestic manufacturer of solar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in Mountain Iron, I don't know if anyone's from Midwest here. No. Yeah. Mountain Iron mining area. It's a pretty, again, I'd say 85% of the job force is up there. It's about an hour north of Duluth, are mining jobs. So we worked with a manufacturer to sort of stand up a module manufacturing. And the way we can help is we have a balance sheet and we have supply needs. So when you go to a manufacturer in the US and say, we will buy materials with a certain technology roadmap for 3 years, that allows you to stand up US production. And it's more and more important for a number of reasons. One is, I think for the clean energy movement to succeed in the US, it can't just be finance and buying materials from outside the US. I think the political landscape in this US, which is pretty divided, it's about 50-50, I would say. And on the environment, I would argue it's actually we have the majority, even if Democrats and Republicans on most issues, but the parties don't behave that way. The way to get through that is manufacturing. So for us, there's an imperative to change the policy environment. So putting manufacturing in red districts is super important to keeping a federal and state policy framework that supports clean energy deployment. So we're going to do things like that. To your example, we won't ever build modules or inverters, but as a user, we have a lot of sort of attributes which we can lend to sort of like hopefully exceed that industry. And it's a pretty exciting time right now in manufacturing in the US for clean energy, not only in solar, but in wind. It is going to be impacted to some degree by the election this year. So, you know, obviously, I think we're watching with bated breath on how that policy outcome sort of shakes out. But my hope, just as someone who cares deeply about this industry and deeply about how we do in this country, in these communities, is getting these kind of companies to work together in coalition. Doesn't mean they need to be all under one roof, but sharing IP, sharing financing, hopefully allows us to sort of lift all the boats at once.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible story because when I think about you going up your supply chain, first of all, I wasn't even thinking about manufacturing panels. I mean, there's just a division, you know, there's people who put panels up in communities, there's people who finance it. And so the vertical integration of that's really interesting, but the visionary part of going up your supply chain. And when you think about big players like Amazon or Walmart and stuff, and how much lighter of a load burden they would have to carry, what they have to do up their supply chain is probably easier than what you're talking about, right? They could demand simply that their suppliers use green energy, as opposed to building from mining material solar panels, which is where you're going. It's pretty amazing. But that does bring us to the question. I think in some sense, this is a case of energy justice being necessary for renewable energy in some sense, right? What you've mapped out a little bit is there has to be jobs for certain populations. This has to be creative in people's lives beyond just, oh, here's renewable energy, use it, right? So if you, and then I'll flip the question in a second, but if you could just expand a little bit on that last point about the vital importance of thinking about the social context for us to make the transition to renewable energy. You've already done a little bit of that, but do you have any more you want to add on that front?
Yeah, no, so I'd sort of reframe it a little bit. It doesn't have to be. It's a choice as a community we need to make. And I think we just have to keep that in mind because that requires public policy holders, private stakeholders to make that case and to convince folks. So the analogy I would use is from an industrial standpoint, we periodically have these industrial booms, right? Industrialization of the auto industry, the boom of the internet, clean energy will be one, AI, some of the stuff we're doing in biosciences. And the question always for a policymaker, and I think citizens, should be, what is the impact on our social fabric and our economic fabric? And I would argue that the tech boom has been very disappointing from an equity lens. If you think about it, early to mid 90s, there was so much promise. This was also, a lot of these technologies were federally invested in. So they're kind of like ours as all citizens. But what do? They create some phenomenal companies that have made some great impact, but they've exacerbated inequity. Inequity did not decrease over the last 20 to 30 years, it actually increased. So if you care about that policy outcome, you're like, whoa, what happened and what went wrong? As I do, and I'm sure most of you do here because you're in this course. So then the question becomes, how is clean energy going to be different? And I'm not convinced that outcome is certain yet. And I think there's certain things that I'm super optimistic about, but there's some challenges. So if you think about to go back, you have to look at the history of it. It's difficult to rectify a historical challenge without understanding history. At a high level, and we can go deeper into it if there's interest later, the energy grid has been built on the backs of structural inequities. And what do I mean by that? Substations where energy companies pollute aren't happening in the nice suburbs or the wealthy areas. They're all being sited in neighborhoods where they can't fight that. Incinerators, fossil fuels, Cancer Alley down in the Mississippi Valley. That all happens primarily in Black and Brown and LMI communities. I mean, that's the way our sort of system has been built. And utilities and some of these large energy players could look at clean energy and say, well, we're just going to approach it the same way. We're going to decarbonize because there's huge political pressure on climate change, and we'll get on the bandwagon, as many of them have from the corporate communications. I mean, it makes me sick to watch ExxonMobil. In the last couple of weeks, I was watching, I think, some of sports games with my son, and they have this whole media campaign on how they're greening everything. I'm like, wow, that's pretty shitty, but clever. And you just wonder, does that really resonate? And is it authentic? Obviously, it's not, but who knows how users digest that. But the reality is they could just see it, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create a job force that mirrors what the current job force in energy looks like. We'll put all the externalities of clean energy in the same communities. And that's that's their playbook for many players. On the other hand, the opportunity is these technologies are so fundamentally different. They're decentralized, they're intelligent, they're dynamic, and they can create economic benefits in so many more communities. The analogy I would look at is like, it does, the energy industry looks like mainframes, massive facilities in select areas, loud, externalities, pollution. But on the other hand, now with technology and software and solar and storage, you can distribute it. And that creates tax revenues in communities. It's cleaner, it's aesthetically pleasing, but it has to be super distributed. And what you're going to hear is sort of it's not a dog whistle, it's an energy whistle, I'll call it, is like, oh, that's not going to be reliable. Oh, that's going to be way too costly. These are kind of like the tropes that they throw out. And you can probably figure out who I'm alluding to. And that's the battle that we're in, is do you build a new grid? Do you build it with these technologies that we have? And I would argue we should. These technologies should be built in a different way because they have different benefits. And that's where, to me, the social equity lens comes in. We no longer have to be in an environment where energy reliability is going to be different in communities, because most communities should now have resiliency with solar and storage. Most communities now should get the benefits of tax revenues and lease revenues. Most energy communities should have the jobs that come with it. It shouldn't just be a select few. And that, to me, is the battle now that we're going to have for the next 20 years. It's less about decarbonization. I'm optimistic for the grid that we can manage decarbonization, but the battle is going to be, is there an equity lens? Is there a disruptive lens to how we build that grid back? And it's not a red or blue issue. You'll see people on both sides of the aisles have surprising opinions on it. I look at certain states in the South, where they have Democratic PUC commissioners just siding with big energy, right? Because it's energy and politics are so tied, like we're intertwined. And hopefully, like when you go out and work in the field, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, I would just ask you to take on that mantle, because I believe it's going to be better for the environment. I think it's better for the community, and we can actually create a energy economy that creates much more equity and sort of cures some of the ills of inequity that we have in our society today. And it's very fundamentally, the opportunity is very different than, I would argue, than some of the software and biosciences, which I think are just much harder to do that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, for me, the thing you said in the answering last time, well, it was just the visionary part of thinking about going into red states, going to parts of the workforce that to me, because I'm, in environmental justice work, I always think about how much justice is necessary to achieve our environmental outcomes, and vice versa. How does environment help us? And there's a politics around keeping the base and support for clean energy. And you by thinking about manufacturing and thinking about siting and things like that, you're helping to build that. The flip side of that is, and I think the caution is, we think of the technology as potentially more just, right? But it could be rolled out in ways that are less just, right? Also, and
Absolutely.
it's interesting. I don't think there's a clear answer to this, but for example, 10% of the Marshall Plan, for example, at the end of World War II, was spent getting Europe off of coal, which was a capitalist play. They didn't like the workers. They got in the way of the energy system, right? So a lot of the Marshall Plan was focused on getting Europe off of coal and onto oil, where workers were not as much of an issue. And obviously coal workers remain a powerful force in many parts of the world, but that was a structural nature of the difference between coal energy and oil energy, right? And similarly with renewables, there is this incredible opportunity for it to be decentralized and all those other things. And yet, right, it's possible that that it could be as less democratic and stuff like that. Let me ask the online audience if you have questions. You have about 10 more minutes to put them in, and Julia will bring them. Do we have any yet? Okay, I'll turn to them in one more second. I want to explore a little bit, and then we'll come to the students as well. If you could talk a little bit about the role of how one of the things we're exploring in an independent study here at the Center for Environmental Justice is how to measure the impact of Justice 40. What are the metrics for success when money is spent on clean energy in a community? And one of the things that comes up in involving communities in solar and community solar is the costs of community involvement and community ownership and community engagement versus the reality of, you have money in the bank, it's earning interest, you got to get it deployed, get it used, right? Money has just the extra layer of time that it might take. So there's a tension I've found in talking to people like you about between the deepest visions we might have about how a community might own or deploy solar themselves with the help of a company versus a more out-of-the-box solution that feels less engaging to the community, if you know what I'm talking about. And what are some of the trade-offs in that kind of in having communities really own their energy fates and getting renewables out fast?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So my personal opinion is in most cases, communities and community members are not equipped to own solar. And community solar. I just think it's messy. It has a tax policy in the US is super arcane. And the reality is I worry about the experience. It creates a really disjointed experience. So in community solar, there was this concept of community-owned shared solar. So idea would be like you'd own part of the panel and sort of everyone would own it. There was a lot of promise with it, I think probably 10 years ago from a policy standpoint. That's kind of waned completely. There's definitely a challenge when we talk to our stakeholders, a lot of environmental justice organizations, they do want that, and they've asked for it. And me personally, I've tried to dissuade them that I'm not sure that's needed. I think it's better for communities to engage based on the permitting, job requirements. So I look like at a state like Illinois. Illinois has a robust community solar program where they have this construct that they're holding developer and owners' feet to the fire and saying, if you want to be on the grid under this policy framework, we are going to hold you accountable. And they have this term, equity eligible contractors. We want to certain, and I think that's a better area to focus on. And I think Governor Pritzker in Illinois and his team have done a phenomenal job about thinking about equity. Strange to say a billionaire is the one trying to hold equitable outcomes, but they're a state that is far ahead compared to others. And then engagement, it takes two hands to clap. So in a state like New York, there's a lot of pressure. There's a vast amount of community solar subscribers of, okay, we need more LMI subscribers to participate in it. The challenge is the state and the utilities are the ones who control that data. We actually have to spend quite a bit of capital to find. There is a lot of not great issues to sort of like, you can't ask people for tax returns, but it's much easier if the person's on a LIHEAP program, we should just know about it. If they opt in, tell us and that. Utilities like, oh, no, right? And
It's LIHEAP is Low Income Housing and Energy Assistance Program, which shows up on tax returns, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
But or you're on a separate utility bill rate if you need assistance.
Right.
Utilities don't want to give that up. And their view is that they're going to trust us more than a private company, which there's debate. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but utilities, when you look at their standing in communities, it's pretty tough. So
so you're saying you would like to know which low-income customers you can serve, and it's harder to get the data because the
Absolutely.
utilities have it.
And-
They're not willing to give it to
and
you.
that's a cost.
Right.
So my policy framework would be that information should be available.
Mm-hmm.
Owners should have to sign up to a customer bill of rights.
Mm-hmm.
No hoodwinking them, no teaser rates, no nonsense like that. There should be strong penalties for accessing the data. But utilities need to get out of the way. I think this to me is less about community ownership, community engagement. It's about what is the role of the utility.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, I believe utilities really good at transmission and distribution wires. They should just focus on that. Utility boardrooms are like, no, we want a piece of this pie. We want to sell more services. We want the community solar thing. And we're going through a battle in New York. Unfortunately, I think Governor Hochul has kind of signed this thing where New York Power Authority, NYPA, would sort of almost get like a head lead of everyone over the private sector of doing LMI community solar, which I just don't get. It doesn't cognitively that there seems to be a lot of issues there. So the question is, how do we do that? I do think there is, to your point, a lot of interest among the stakeholders still about community ownership. I don't think if the IRA bill, any of our tax policy makes it easy.
Mm.
So my question in these discussions to them is like, how do you get that? What is engagement? And for me, the engagement should be community solar is kind of an entree. Like the way we think about a customer, it's a path to lower their energy costs and also decarbonize other parts of life. So if you think about it, tax incentives for heat pumps and insulation and EV charging or shared EV ownership, it's like, it's so confusing, even for a user like me. And I'd say, I'm an energy dork, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, and the idea that utilities are going to be able to do that and speed up adoption, I think is a hard policy premise to argue. But utilities have a lot of resources, a lot of lobbying power.
Yeah.
And they're worried because if you think about it, I don't know how much work's been done on the history of utilities. Utilities used to own the whole value chain. They used to own power facilities, the lines, and they were forced by regulators in most states to separate themselves. So they don't own that. And I think there's this pining among certain utilities to go back to that.
Yeah.
And again, I'm painting a very broad stroke picture. Lots of utilities are different in this regards. But to me, to get to community engagement, it's better data, better customer bills of rights, and then I think the technology can cure some of these issues.
Yeah.
If that happens.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think in the field and other developers we've spoken to, the challenge with sort of the question between the consumer as just a customer or the consumer as owner customer. And given the, size of the energy industry, there is a desire on community groups and environmental justice groups. Hey, this is a decentralized technology. Why can't we? They're not saying, I mean, very few communities think that a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant should be community owned, but there is a sense in renewables that there can be in smaller chunks some way. But the regulatory thickets are in a lot of ways worse, and some of the technology choices are complicated. So, you've given a lot of great macro reasons. There are also just micro reasons in developing a project that just have to do with how long you have the money for, the cost of holding the money. Can you take 6 extra months to build literacy in the community for the technology, or not, depending on where you're at and what your financing looks like. And then there's the sort of macro issues you're raising, which are really, really interesting. Okay, let's see if we have any questions from the audience, the online audience. We're with them for about 5 or 7 more minutes. Julia, do you want to read a couple of them in a row and then we can take them on, or we have a trend? Go for it.
Okay. The first question is if you can speak a little bit about Nexamp's land use decision-making process. So whether you encounter people with concerns about what lands are used for solar farms, and if so, what some of those concerns have been and how or if Nexamp has addressed them.
Absolutely. So land use is a big issue, and just permitting in general. If I had to say the 2 reasons we'll miss our decarbonization goals, it would be interconnection queues, which we can talk about later, and land use. Most people, whether red or blue, love clean energy. They don't want it in their communities. And I don't take that lightly. It's a fact that there's a lot of misinformation. So land use sort of concerns typically will be, this could be used for agricultural purposes. Why are we putting solar on it? That's one host of uses. Two is a visual. How will this hurt my property values? It's going to look ugly. I don't think solar and wind looks ugly, but there's a decent amount of constituents that are concerned about that. How it's going to affect future development in our area. So those are kind of some of the assembly. There are other ones that we go through, but a few of the things that we've tried to do and be good partners. If we're in communities where we know that it is going to be a brutal decision-making process and the community just doesn't want us there, we pass. We move on and we look elsewhere. We don't want to force our ways into communities. But we do also try to educate people. So there's a lot of misinformation there. And there's also confluence of, we haven't proven it, but definitely there's a trace and we're getting closer to where some of that money's coming from that are standing up these groups. Groups that just don't want renewable adoption, period. They are making sure that these noises are as loud as possible. Not saying that these concerns aren't valid, but there's definitely a coordinated campaign.
So you're saying there are local, regional, national groups that are funding
absolutely
NIMBY opposition in communities and powering it.
I would say one of the groups is like rhymes with a popular soda. So you can figure that out. Absolutely. And they're astute at it and they're effective. I mean, some groups had doctors coming in, solar is going to cause cancer. That is such a BS.
Wow.
Like, come on.
Wow.
Toxic materials. Great thing about solar is no toxic materials unless you use thin film solar. We don't use thin film solar. Unfortunately, that is what America's best at making right now is thin film solar for solar. So how do we tackle these land issues? One is with community solar, we go into communities and we're like, the benefits are going to accrue to your community. We're not trying to build solar in this area and then all the benefits are going 90 miles west, north, east, whatever. And that's a powerful argument that does reduce the temperature in these land use committees quite a bit. Number two, for farmers, they're our best advocates. Farmers like, we need a stable revenue stream if you want us to continue to farm and be in these communities, which is really important. And then the other thing that we sort of have done, and if you go to our website or YouTube channel, we've really tried to engage the ag community to be long-term stakeholders in these facilities. So pollinators, honey, we've done, which is pretty cool and easy. It actually makes the sites really beautiful, especially in spring and summer in the Northeast. Livestock. So goats don't work because goats are fairly rambunctious. Sheep work really well. Instead of lawnmowers, we use sheep. Better for carbon intensity, better for farmers who need land. And literally they just let them roam. And it's fenced, so there's no predators that come there. And it's been a huge success. So there's ways you can do it as an owner or operator. You do have to meet stakeholders and you have to address concerns. You can't mow them down. But it is a challenging environment. And I think part of it is there are groups there that are offering their political capital to sort of slow down sort of the implementation of solar and wind. But for me, the strategy for us has really been, how are you creative in making sure that the community is continuing to get value from it? How are you also designing solar facilities? I mean, I've told our team I'd love someone from an architectural background just to reevaluate, like, how do we integrate these better into built spaces or into open spaces that it feels like something's good? Because like for me, I don't want to build something where there's like members of the community that hate looking at it. It's not good for our brand. It's not good for the solar community, but it's challenging because part of it also is some developers don't behave like us. They will use all their political and legal muscle to push projects through. And then sometimes we have those experiences and then residents come to us with that experience in mind and they look at us with that lens. But it's a difficult issue. It is not easy. We have spent a lot of time with some of the universities in Boston on land use, on protecting soil habitats. The reality is when you build open field solar, greenfield, it does protect the soil. and allows the soil to regenerate. Agriculture also can be very destructive if not done properly. But we have to also, as an industry, make sure that we're implementing best practices. There is a new movement also, which I'm hoping takes off, of integrating PV into farming completely. So if you think about it, these panels have partial shading. There's ways to do certain types of crops below the panel lines. You do have to build the line of sight a little bit higher, so it's a little bit more costly. But if you can integrate agriculture with PV, that's another sort of effort that's taken. We've done in a cranberry bog, for example, in the Cape area outside of Massachusetts, which has also been a pretty cool success.
One of the things we're doing this semester is building an AI tool, a small AI tool for communities in New England to help communities fight facilities or understand how to prevent bad siting. And Zaid
I
said
was
to me,
joking, I was like, don't do that. That might come back to stop going with.
it could also be a tool for NIMBY activity more generally, right? And so it's an interesting. We'll have to see what we can do to tune to bias the AI. I don't know, but and around those things.
Good balance.
Yeah. Another question from online, and then we'll close up and go to the students for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about how Nexamp is grappling with the equity issues related to mineral resource extraction, both here in the US and abroad, required for manufacturing solar?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the mineral resource issue is more pronounced with storage and batteries. So if you think about module manufacturing, the technology we use is polysilicon. Silicon is an abundant mineral. Extraction can be problematic. The way we've thought about it is we do an assessment of the whole value chain. So we spend time wherever all our balance of materials are coming from, we do an assessment because we want to make sure that whatever equipment we're using reflects our value system and reflects our carbon reduction goals. It's not easy, especially with batteries. I'd say it's much more challenging. My hope is with the Inflation Reduction Act, you're going to see a lot more U.S. manufacturing and a lot more manufacturing in countries that are closer in proximity and allow audits to happen. But also in Asia, there's a lot of pressure from buyers. We're not the only one. There are buyers like Amazon and Walmart that are thinking about these issues. And a lot of those companies as well are trying to use more renewable energy to power extraction. Some, not all, are trying to improve their labor practices, but it is a real issue. It's not, I wish I had like a great answer that we have cracked the nut on it. It's something that concerns us. It's something that we have a whole supply chain team that spends a number of hours, not only just on minerals, but on labor justice and labor policies. But I'm optimistic. I do think there's a broader labor and environmental movement in not only the US, but abroad that's thinking through these issues. My hope is we're in a much better space in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, thank you. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up with our online audiences. Next week, Chris Castro will be speaking as Chief of Staff for the Office of State and Community Energy Programs at the Department of Energy. He's going to be giving a general overview of the Inflation Reduction Act and Justice 40, and as a way for us to kind of roll into what's happening currently, the intense activity over the next few years being driven by the IRA. Later in the semester, we're going to also have somebody specifically speaking about something that Zaid spoke about, community benefits agreements. One of the Department of Energy officials who's at the Loan Programs Office will be talking about their efforts to ensure that contractors and other players are building these facilities with some of these concerns in mind. And with that, we'll wrap up with our online audience. Thanks, and see you next week.